August 1944. Heavy heat sits on a Texas prison camp called Camp Hearn, where barbed wire cuts the bright sky into sharp lines. 12 German women step off a truck, thin and tired, sure they are about to face beatings, hard work, and slow starvation, just like the Nazi radio had warned them. But a cowboy in a dusty hat looks them over, shakes his head, and says almost gently, "You're too thin to work." Beyond the fence, a horse snorts, a windmill creaks, and the air smells not only of sweat and diesel, but of hay and leather. These women came expecting whips and hunger. Instead, they were given saddles, warm meals, and a kind of freedom that shocked even the US Army. This is a true World War II story of enemies treated almost like family. Yeah, and it broke every idea they had about America and about war. If you want more powerful stories like this, please subscribe, like this video, and stay with me to the very end, because their last ride in Texas is something you will not forget. To understand why a Texas rancher once said, "You're too thin to work," we have to go back months earlier to a very different kind of heat. In early 1944, under the hard sun of North Africa, German field hospitals and radio posts began to fall quiet. The front had collapsed. British and American units moved in fast, their trucks grinding over sand that still smelled of cordite and diesel. Among the thousands of prisoners taken in Tunisia were a small, unusual group, 12 German servicewomen. They were nurses, clerks, radio operators. None had fired a rifle in anger, but all wore the uniform of a regime that promised victory. From the first hours of capture, fear walked with them. For years, Nazi radio had told them what to expect from the enemy. Americans, they were told, were corrupt and cruel. "They will use you, starve you, work you to death," one camp rumor repeated. One of the women, Greta, later wrote, "We believed we would be treated worse than animals. We thought we would never see our homes again." The paradox was simple and brutal. They were terrified of a world that, in truth, planned to feed and house them better than their own collapsing army could. The women were separated from male prisoners, counted, listed, and moved like pieces in a vast machine. By 1944, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war would be held in the United States, but female POWs were rare enough to draw stares even from experienced guards. To the American officers, they were a problem to be solved. How to move 12 enemy women safely across an ocean already thick with U-boats. Trucks carried them to a North African port that stank of fish, hot metal, and bunker fuel. There they were, marched up a gangway into the dim belly of a converted transport ship. The air below deck was thick with oil and sweat. Hammocks swung in tight rows. Steel walls sweated with condensation. At night, the engines roared so loudly that prayer, if whispered, vanished into the vibration. Food was simple and strange to them. White bread instead of dark, thin soup. Coffee that tasted burnt and bitter. It was more than many German civilians were getting by 1944, but to the women, weak from months of shortages, it barely slowed the weight loss. Lisa, a clerk from Stuttgart, remembered thinking, "If this is the beginning, how will we look at the end?" The convoy crossed more than 3,000 miles of Atlantic water in a little over 2 weeks. Sometimes the women were allowed on deck in guarded groups. Salt wind slapped their faces. They saw other ships on the horizon, grey shapes in long lines, a moving factory of war. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had turned out over 1,000 Liberty ships, and now that industrial tide carried even its enemies. When land finally rose on the horizon, it did not look like the smoky, ruined coast they knew from Europe. Cranes reached into the sky. Warehouses lined busy docks. Behind them, faint in the distance, They could see tall buildings and smoke that smelled of coal, not burning cities. "We looked at the harbour," one later recalled, and thought, so this is the country that has so much and yet wants more. From the port, armed guards moved them into special rail cars. The train clattered inland, steel wheels beating a steady rhythm. Through dirty windows they saw an America that felt impossible. Fields rolled by, green and gold. Small towns flashed past with filling stations, cafes and shop windows crowded with goods. They were prisoners, but they saw more meat hanging in butcher shops at one station than most German families had seen in a month. At one stop, the smell of fried food and coffee drifted in through an open door. The women held back, hands cuffed or bound by simple rope. An American guard, barely older than they were, handed up a metal container of water without being asked. "Here," he said, not unkindly. It was a small act, but for women expecting beatings it did not fit the story they had been told. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, and it did not match the image of American beasts burned into their minds. Day by day the cities grew smaller and the land wider. The air grew hotter, heavier. Trees changed shape. Signs were all in English, unreadable to most of them. Some of the women pressed their faces to the glass at night, watching the lights of lonely farmhouses slide by, each one proof that the war had not come here the way it had to Europe. Finally, after traveling more than 1,000 miles inside the United States, the train slowed near a small Texas town called Hearn. The air that rushed in when the doors opened was thick and wet, smelling of mud, creosote from the railroad ties, and something else, dust on dry grass. An officer read from a clipboard, 12 German female prisoners, non-combat personnel, for transfer to Camp Hearn. They stepped down onto American soil as captives, carrying only the clothes on their backs, the weight of fear, and the lies they had been told about the people now holding them. Beyond the tracks and the wire, another kind of shortage was brewing, and a rancher named Tom Wheeler was staring at empty fields and broken fences, wondering how he would keep his land alive. Camp Hearn sat in the middle of Texas farm country, about 15 miles from the nearest town. From a distance, it looked like a small wooden city dropped onto the flat land. Long rows of barracks, a tall water tower, guard posts at the corners. Up close, you saw the hard edges. Barbed wire fences glittered in the sun. Searchlights waited on tall poles. Boots crunched on packed dirt that smelled of dust, sweat, and disinfectant. By 1944, more than 4,000 German prisoners were held there, part of the roughly 50,000 POWs spread across Texas in over 30 branch camps. Most were men captured in North Africa and Italy, but a few dozen were women scattered in small groups. Regulations were clear. Prisoners could be used as labor, but only under guard, only in daylight, and only for approved tasks. The US Army paid their labor at a set rate, about 80 cents a day credited on paper, while farmers and ranchers paid the government. Inside the wire, life followed a strict rhythm. Mornings smelled of thin coffee and army bread. A bell rang for roll call. Guards counted men and women in German, English, and numbers. Prisoners cleaned barracks, lined up for food, and marched to work details. A former American guard later said, "It was tight but not cruel. We had rules to follow and we followed them." Outside the wire, another crisis was growing. Texas was rich in land but short on people. By the summer of 1944, more than 1 million Texans were in uniform. On many farms, almost every able-bodied man between 18 and 35 was gone, either in Europe or the Pacific. Cotton fields went unpicked, fences sagged, cattle wandered through broken wire. One state report warned that without extra help, as much as 20% of some crops might be lost. Tom Wheeler felt that crisis every time he rode across his ranch north of Hearn. His land spread over 4,000 acres, pasture, small crop fields, creeks lined with scrub trees. The work never ended, mending fence, checking water tanks, moving cattle between pastures. Before the war, he had his 2 grown sons and a half-dozen hired hands to help. By 1944, his sons wore uniforms overseas, and most of his cowboys had gone to war plants or the oil fields, where pay was better and work was safer. "The grass keeps growing whether boys go to war or not," Wheeler once told a neighbor. He was a practical man with a sunburned neck, a good horse, but more chores than daylight. When he heard in town that Camp Hearn was sending out prisoners to cut timber and pick cotton, he listened hard. Maybe that was his answer. The US government ran a formal program. Farmers could apply at the county office for POW labor. They would get a set number of workers for a set number of hours each day. Armed guards came with them. No weapons were given to prisoners. They ate in separate mess tents or in the fields under watchful eyes. Local newspapers carried small notices. Prisoners available for agricultural labor. Apply at county agent's office. One hot afternoon, Wheeler stopped by that office. The room smelled of old paper, ink, and the faint sour of sweat. On a bulletin board, among posters about war bonds and ration stamps, he saw a new typed sheet. 12. German women available for agricultural labor under strict supervision. He read it twice. Women? He had heard of Italian and German men picking cotton and chopping wood, but women behind barbed wire was something else. At home that night, over a plain supper that tasted of rationing, thin meat, homegrown vegetables, coffee stretched with chicory, he told his wife, Martha. "Women?" she said slowly. "Doing ranch work?" "I need hands," he answered. "Right now, I don't have the right to be picky." The next week he drove his truck to Camp Hearn, dust boiling up behind the tires. Beside him sat his foreman, a broad man everyone called Dutch. His family had come from Bavaria 2 generations earlier, and he still spoke German. The road to the camp ran past fields of corn and sorghum, some neat, some choked with weeds where no one had time to work them. At the camp gate, a guard checked their papers. The air was already hot, heavy with the smell of sun-baked wood, and the distant mess hall where onions and canned meat sizzled in big pans. Major Robert Stills, the camp commander, met them just inside the wire. His shirt was neatly pressed despite the heat. Stills walked them past barracks and watchtowers, explaining the rules in a flat, careful voice. Work hours limited by the sun, guards always present, no private contact, no favors. "They are enemy personnel," he said, "not guests." Finally, in the narrow shade beside a mess hall, Wheeler saw them. 12 women standing in a loose line. Their grey uniforms hung off their frames, cheekbones pushed against thin skin. One arm was in a sling. Another woman's hands shook, though the air was hot and still. They looked less like farm workers and more like patients from a hospital he had never meant to run. Greta, Lisa, Anna, he did not know their names yet. He only saw faces that did not match the posters he had seen of bold enemy women with strong arms and cold eyes. Again, what propaganda had promised was not what stood in front of him. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality. And reality looked very fragile. Dutch spoke to them softly in German. They answered with short words, tired voices. "They say they are fit for work," Dutch translated. Wheeler studied them, thinking of barbed wire, of army rules, of his empty pastures, and of how easily a thin woman could collapse in the noon sun. Right there, a new idea began to form, one that did not quite fit the regulation forms on the major's desk. What came out of his mouth next would surprise not only the women, but the army that held them. Wheeler stood in front of the thin line of women, hat in his hand. He looked from face to face, then down at their loose uniforms and sharp bones. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Tell them," he said to Dutch. "They're too thin to work." Dutch translated into German. The words hung in the hot air. For a moment, the women thought it was a cruel joke. Work was the one thing they were sure the Americans would demand. Greta later wrote, "We waited for laughter or shouting. Instead, there was only silence and his troubled face." Major Stills frowned. "They meet the requirement?" he said. "Regulations say all able prisoners must perform productive labor." Wheeler nodded slowly. "Maybe so, Major. But you send these ladies into a Texas field for 8, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they'll drop before the first fence line. That's not productive either." There it was, the paradox. The army needed them to work. Wheeler needed help. Yet the very hunger that made them seem strong enough to send overseas now made them useless for the kind of heavy labor the rules assumed. The major hesitated. Paper orders did not mention special treatment for women. "What are you suggesting, Wheeler?" "Let me take them," Wheeler said. "I'll sign for all 12. I'll use them on the ranch, but not in the fields. Not at first. I'll get some weight on them, build them up. Then they'll be more use to you and to me." Stills studied him. On his desk were neat files, each showing how many man-hours of prisoner labor went to county farms every week. It was a simple equation. So many men, so many acres saved. There was no line for healing first, yet he also knew sick prisoners meant reports, inspections and trouble. "You understand?" the major said at last. "I cannot authorize special activities, agricultural labor only, guarded, logged." "I understand, Major," Wheeler answered. "Just put us down for 12 workers." That evening, Wheeler drove home under a red sky. His truck smelled of dust and old leather. Martha met him at the door, wiping her hands on a flour towel. The kitchen was warm with the smell of beans and cornbread. Simple food, but rich compared to the camp rations. He told her what he had seen, the sling, the shaking hands, the hollow faces. "They're supposed to fix my labor problem," he said, "but they look more like they belong in your pantry than my pastures." Martha sat down at the wooden table. Dutch joined them, his big hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The small house grew quiet except for the ticking clock and the faint sound of crickets outside. "They have to work," Wheeler said. "The army made that clear." "Work, yes," Martha answered. "But what kind of work?" She thought for a moment. "They could help here. Cleaning, canning, sewing. God knows I could use the help." Wheeler shook his head. "Some maybe, but—" I saw their eyes. They're used to doing important jobs, even if it was for the wrong side. Nurses, clerks, radio people. If I lock them in a kitchen, they'll feel like they've been put in a box. That won't build them up. It'll break them different." Dutch cleared his throat. "Back in Bavaria, my aunt said girls learned to ride before they could read proper. Maybe some of them know horses." The room went quiet. Martha looked up sharply. "Why not?" she said. "You have gentle horses, safe corrals. They could learn to ride, check fences, move the smaller groups of cattle. It's real work, but it gives them some control, something strong under them instead of just fear." Wheeler stared at her. "Teach enemy prisoners to ride my horses?" He imagined the colonel. It did not look pleased. "Will the army approve it?" Dutch asked. "Probably not," Wheeler answered. Then he sighed. "But the rules say agricultural labor. They don't say a man has to be the one holding the reins," to put it plainly. "You always told our boys, do the right thing first, then answer questions later." He rubbed his temples. It was a quiet rebellion, planned over coffee at a plain kitchen table. They would take the 12 women. They would do the work on paper. So many hours, so many tasks, so many acres checked. But the path to that would run through the horse. Later, Lisa would remember that moment from the other side. "We did not know about his kitchen," she wrote. "We only knew that instead of saying work harder, he said, "You are too thin." It was the first time since capture that someone saw us as women, not just as uniform. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality. And it ran against almost every story both sides had told about the enemy. 3 days later, just after dawn, a military truck rolled out of Camp Hearn with 12 German women in the back, heading north over the dusty road. They expected fields and tools and endless rows of hard earth. What they saw when they reached Wheeler's Run would change everything. The truck rattled to a stop just inside Wheeler's ranch gate. The sun was still low, painting the eastern sky gold and pink. Cool air carried the smell of dew on grass, mixed with dust and a sharper scent the women did not at first recognize: hay and horse sweat. They climbed down, chains clinking lightly. Instead of rows of crops, they saw a wide dirt corral fenced with rough boards. Inside stood 8 saddled horses, calm in the morning light. Their coats shone brown, black, and cream. One flicked its ears, another snorted, steam puffing in the cool air. For a moment, no one moved. "We thought this was some kind of test," Lisa later wrote. "We looked for the shovels, the heavy tools. Instead, there were animals waiting for riders we did not believe we could be." Wheeler stood by the fence with Martha and 2 older ranch hands. Dutch translated as Wheeler spoke. "Today you will not go to the fields," he said. "First, you will learn to be around the horses, then maybe you will learn to ride, if you wish." The offer itself felt like a paradox. They were prisoners, yet they were being asked what they wanted. Back in Germany, propaganda had shown Americans as brutal. Now an American was giving them a choice. One woman stepped forward. Her name was Greta. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were clear. "I taught riding in Bavaria," she told Dutch quietly. "Before the war." Dutch nodded to Wheeler. "She knows horses," he said. Wheeler led her toward a sorrel mare named Honey. Up close, the animal smelled warm and alive, a mix of leather, dust, and sweet hay. Greta reached out. For a few seconds, her fingers hovered over the mare's neck. Then she laid her palm flat on the smooth coat. She began to cry. Not loud, just silent tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. In that moment, she later wrote, "I remembered who I had been before I was a number." Wheeler's men showed them how to brush the horses in long strokes, how to speak softly and move calmly. The stiff army boots of the guards crunched outside the fence, but the work inside was slow and careful. By the time the sun had climbed higher, 6 women were grooming horses and the others watched, learning. From that day, the pattern became clear. 6 days a week, a truck brought the women at dawn. They worked until early afternoon, when Texas heat turned dangerous. At first, they stayed in and around the stables, grooming, feeding, cleaning stalls, mending leather tack. It was real labor, moving hay bales, hauling water, but it allowed them to rest when they needed, to build strength instead of breaking what little they had left. Within 2 weeks, they began sitting in saddles. Wheeler used a lunge line, a long rope that kept horse and rider moving in a small circle. The horse walked. The woman tried to find balance. Some clung tight, eyes wide, others relaxed faster. Greta moved with the easy grace of someone returning to an old language. Martha came out every day. She wore a plain dress and sun hat and brought cold lemonade in a big glass jar. She showed them how to braid the horses' manes, how to sit a little taller, how to laugh at small mistakes. She also talked about her sons overseas, about her own mother, who had come from Germany with nothing but a trunk and a recipe book. "My mother said she missed the smell of the forests," Martha told Greta one morning. Greta just nodded, eyes wet, hand resting on Honey's neck. After about a month, Lisa asked if she could try riding free Without the lunge line, Wheeler saddled Pete, an old gelding who had taught 3 generations of wheelers and ranch hands. Lisa climbed up with help. Her legs shook. Dutch repeated Wheeler's calm instructions. "Hold the reins here. Gentle. Squeeze with your legs to move. Pull back to stop. He wants to listen." Pete walked. Dust puffed under his hooves. At first, Lisa sat stiff, her hands gripping the reins too tight. Slowly, her shoulders dropped, her back straightened. By the 3rd circle around the corral, she was smiling. When she finally slid down, her legs almost gave out. "For a little time," she told Martha, "I forgot I was a prisoner." By October, they were doing more than circles. In groups of 2 or 3, always with a guard nearby, they rode along fence lines, checking posts and wire. On paper, they logged hours of agricultural inspection across hundreds of acres. In practice, they were learning the land in a way no barbed wire fence could teach. News of this unusual program spread. Other ranchers came to watch. Some scoffed. Others were quietly impressed. It also brought the Army's attention. One Tuesday, Major Stills arrived with a colonel from the regional prisoner office. Their jeep rolled up in a cloud of dust. They stepped out into air that smelled of sun on dry boards and fresh manure. They watched in silence as 2 women rode slowly around the corral, and others cleaned hooves and checked saddles. "This is not what I expected," the colonel said at last. "No, sir," Wheeler replied. "But it works. They check fences, move cattle, watch water tanks. Last week they helped bring in strays from the north pasture. Couldn't have done it on foot." The colonel looked again. He saw women who no longer shook from hunger, who moved with purpose instead of fear. "Any trouble?" he asked. "Escape attempts? Discipline?" "None," Wheeler said. "They work hard. They follow orders. They seem grateful." This wasn't propaganda. It was reality, and it was written in healthier faces and smooth daily reports. "Continue," the colonel said finally, "but keep records. Every hour, every task." As the days grew shorter and cooler, the women sang sometimes as they rode, low German songs mixing with the creak of leather and the jingle of bits. The sound carried across the fields like an answer to distant guns they could no longer hear. Soon another idea would test the Army's patience even more, a plan for one shared evening under the same roof, while the war still burned across the ocean. By late autumn, the Texas heat had eased. Mornings were cool. Breath showed faint in the air when the women first stepped from the truck. They were still prisoners, but they no longer looked like ghosts. Faces had filled out. Hands were steadier. They rode out to check fences and water tanks, the leather creaking under them, horses snorting small white clouds. Work songs came back first. At the water trough or in the barn, one woman would start a German folk tune. Another joined. Before long, the sound of soft harmony mixed with the jingle of harness and the scrape of rakes on the stable floor. Some ranch hands, many with German grandparents, recognized old melodies and hummed along. "It sounded like a farm, not a prison," one hand later said. Small gifts began to travel both ways. The men sometimes brought a pencil, a scrap of writing paper, a tattered English phrase book from town. One evening, Greta came to Wheeler with something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a small horse she had carved from a piece of scrap wood. The curve of the neck, the set of the ears, even the tilt of the head matched Honey, the sorrel mare she rode. "You gave us back our strength," she said through Dutch. "I can only give you this." Prisoners were not supposed to give presents to their guards, yet here was a carved thanks sitting in Wheeler's rough hands. Again, reality did not match the simple enemy picture the war demanded. As December came, the days grew short and sharp. Frost dusted the grass some mornings. Martha watched the women arrive, coats thin, shoulders a little hunched against the wind. One night, as she stacked jars in the pantry and smelled the sharp sweetness of preserved peaches, she spoke to Wheeler. "We should do something for Christmas," she said. "One evening. A real meal. A tree. Songs." He stared at her. "They're prisoners, Martha. The rules." "The rules already bend every time they put a German girl on a Texas horse," she answered. "They are far from home. Maybe their homes are gone. One good night will not lose this war." Wheeler thought of his sons, eating in field tents somewhere overseas. He thought of the women riding his fences without complaint. The next day, he telephoned Camp Hearn, then the colonel in charge of prisoner program. The talks took 3 days. In the end, the colonel agreed, but only with strict limits. Guards present, no alcohol, everyone back behind the wire by nightfall. On paper, it was just an approved holiday meal for work detachment. On Christmas Eve, the truck rolled up while the sky was still pale. The women climbed down into air that smelled of wood smoke and cold earth. When they stepped into the ranch house, warmth hit them like a soft wall. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Pine branches hung along the mantel, bright with paper ornaments cut from old catalogues. The table was set for more than a dozen people. Martha had saved and planned for weeks. There were roast chickens, their skin crisp and brown, mashed potatoes rich with butter, green beans from the summer garden, fresh bread, and a pie made from those gold slices of canned peaches. At that time, an average German civilian might struggle to reach 1,500 calories a day. Here, even prisoners would sit in front of more food than many families in Europe could now imagine. Guards, ranch hands, Wheeler's family, and the 12 German women all took places around the same table. It felt strange at first. Uniforms brushed work shirts, foreign words bumped against English, knives and forks clicked on plates, but hunger and warmth did their work. People began to talk in short phrases with Dutch, and one young guard from East Texas translating where they could. After dinner, Greta taught Martha a German Christmas carol. The women sang first, their voices soft but sure. The room smelled of pine, smoke, and cooling gravy. When they reached the second verse, the young Texas guard joined in, using the words he had learned from his grandmother. Martha covered her mouth with her hand. Later she said, "For a few minutes, I forgot which side anyone was on." Lisa would write, "For that one night, the war was outside. We were not captives and captors. We were just people who missed home." In early 1945, the mood changed again. The army now allowed more regular mail. Letters came slowly, sometimes taking months, but they came. At the same time, Allied bombers were dropping tens of thousands of tons of explosives on German cities each month. The women learned what that meant through ink on paper. Lisa's first letter from home said that her family house in Stuttgart was gone, burned in a raid. Her mother had survived and now lived with cousins in the countryside. Her father was missing since November. She handed the letter to Martha with shaking fingers. Martha sat with her on the back steps, the cold boards under them, and let her cry into her shoulder. Greta's news was different, but just as sharp. The stable where she had taught children to ride had been taken by the army. The horses were slaughtered for meat during a hard winter. For 3 days, she barely spoke. She went through the motions of work like a sleepwalker. Then, on the 4th morning, she went to Honey's stall. She brushed the mare until the coat shone, breathed in the familiar smell of horse and hay, and slowly began to talk again. "Some beauty lives," she wrote later, "even when the world cuts down most of it." The women also wrote back across the ocean. They described horses, open pastures, Christmas dinners, and Americans who said, "You are too thin to work," instead of beating them. Relatives in ruined German streets could hardly believe it. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, but it sounded like a story made up by enemies. Outside Texas, the war kept moving. German armies were falling back on every front. In spring, new orders would come to Camp Hearn. The women's time at the ranch was running out, even as their ties to it grew stronger with every letter sent and every fence line ridden. Soon they would learn what happened when the war ended and where home really was now. In April 1945, a rumor moved through Camp Hearn faster than any truck. Germany was collapsing. Town names the women knew, Königsberg, Cologne, Leipzig, came over the camp loudspeakers as captured, encircled, fallen. One guard remembered, "You could feel the air change. For us, it meant we might go home sooner. For them, it meant they might not have a home to go back to." Out at the ranch, the women kept working. They checked fences that did not really need checking, brushed horses already clean. Busy hands kept fear a little further away. One morning, Lisa asked Wheeler through Dutch, "When the war ends, what happens to us?" He told the truth. "I don't know, but you'll be stronger than when you came. That will matter wherever you go." By summer, orders were clear. The POW program would wind down. Between late 1945 and 1946, the United States would send home almost all of the roughly 400,000 German prisoners it held. At Camp Hearn, that meant closing work detachments, including Wheeler's. Martha insisted on a farewell supper. This time there were no trees or songs in the plan, just a simple meal: stew, bread, coffee. The house smelled of onions, flour, and wood smoke. The women arrived in their worn uniforms, now less loose than before. They brought what they could: small drawings, letters written in careful English, another carved figure or two. The ranch hands laid out gifts as well: sturdy boots, worn but solid work gloves, a few warm coats for the long journey. Greta pressed a folded paper into Martha's hand. It held an address in Bavaria. "If you ever come to Germany," she said, "please find me. I want you to see it when it is green again." Martha nodded, knowing she might never cross the ocean, but also knowing that promises can feed the spirit like food. On their last day, Wheeler did something the rules never imagined. He let the women ride one final, wide loop through the north pastures with only light guard behind them. The morning was bright, the sky a deep blue bowl. Grass brushed their boots. The wind carried the clean smell of sun-warmed earth and cattle. They rode mostly in silence. Each felt the rhythm of the horse under her, the weight of the saddle, the leather reins warm in her hand. "I tried to memorize it," Anna later wrote. "The color of the sky, the sound of the hooves. I thought, if I can remember this, I can survive what comes next." When they returned, they slid from the saddles slowly, touching the horses' necks one more time. Brushes rasped over coats. Hooves were checked for small stones that were not there. They were stretching out the goodbye. Martha took a few photographs with a borrowed camera, 12 women standing beside horses, the wind lifting their hair. None of them knew those pictures would sit in a family album for decades. That evening the truck came. The women climbed in, chains light against steel. As it pulled away, they looked back at the low house, the corral, the windmill turning against the sky. Wheeler and Martha stood at the gate until the dust cloud settled and the road was empty. The ranch had the same number of acres and animals, but it felt different now, as if some new piece of its story had been cut out and carried away. Most of the women reached Germany in late 1945 and early 1946. What they found was worse than they had feared. Streets of broken stone, burned roofs open to the rain, families scattered. Greta did find part of hers in Bavaria. In time, she reopened a small riding stable. Children once again learned to sit a saddle under her eye. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years, thin envelopes with foreign stamps, smelling faintly of dust and old ink. "Today a little boy trotted for the first time," she wrote to Martha. "I thought of Texas." Lisa's path was harder. Her father had died in the last chaos of the war. She trained as a teacher in a ruined Stuttgart and worked with orphans who had lost almost everything. In a 1953 letter she wrote, "I teach them English. Sometimes I use phrases I learned on the ranch. When I say plenty more where that came from, they do not understand, but I remember the full plates and I smile." Other women built lives that kept one foot in each world. A few married American soldiers during the occupation, staying in Germany, but tied to the country that had once held them prisoner. Some later immigrated legally to the United States, a smaller number even finding their way back to Texas. They brought with them the strange skill set of German women who can ride like cowboys. Anna became an artist. Her later paintings showed German women on horseback under a Texas sun, guard towers in the distance, and cowboys offering outstretched hands instead of rifles. In the 1960s, her work hung in galleries in Munich and Stuttgart, quietly asking viewers to rethink easy stories about enemies and friends. Wheeler kept ranching until his death in 1963. Among his papers, Martha found letters from all 12 women, thick with thanks. The small carved horse still sat on the mantel, its wood worn smooth by dusting hands. When Martha died in 1982, her children found those letters and the old photograph of the women and the horses. They did not know every name, but they knew the story. In later years, historians looking at POW programs noticed something unusual in the records from Camp Hearn and Wheeler's ranch. Healthy prisoners, steady work, no escape attempts. The secret was not complex. Treat people with basic dignity and many will answer with their best selves. This wasn't propaganda, but it was reality. They had come as conquerors, they left as students. And in the end, the sharpest weapon in that quiet corner of Texas was not a gun or a fence, but the simple decision to see human beings where others saw only the word enemy. The story of 12 German women on Texas horses is a small thread in a huge war, but it shows a clear truth. One side had more planes, tanks, and ships, but it also had full plates, open land, and enough confidence to treat even its enemies with a measure of care. The women came from a world of fear, hunger, and orders shouted from loudspeakers. On the ranch, they met a quieter power, food shared at one table, skills freely given, and a gate that opened every morning and closed every night without breaking them. In the end, the loudest victory here was not over territory, but over hatred itself, a reminder that even in a brutal war, people can choose to act with simple decency and change how the story is remembered. If you'd like to hear more true World War II stories told this way, human, detailed, and surprising, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. And in the comments, tell me, what part of this story challenged what you thought you knew about the war?